Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Frankly Speaking, and tonight joining me is the New Age guru Deepak Chopra, author, a man who's redefined spirituality, a man who's redefined wellness and health, alternative medicines, a man who's on the scientific board advising the Pope, a man who's done a deep study of the Hindu religion and culture, a man who studied Islam as well. Deepak Chopra, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Navika.
It's a pleasure to have you here. You're the celebrity New Age guru who's redefined spiritualism. That's how the world describes you. So, what is spiritualism? And do you think spiritualism has gotten associated with a certain age bracket, whereas the younger population in the world is still busy sinning rather than getting into the spiritual way of life?
Well, again, first of all, thank you, Navika, for having me. I don't refer to myself as a guru. I'm a medical doctor with an interest in what we call the evolution of consciousness. These days, it's become very fashionable to say, I'm spiritual and not religious. So what is spirituality? It is, in one simple word, self-awareness. Self-awareness. Having said that, most people do not know what the self is. They confuse it with their selfie. So we have sacrificed ourselves for our selfies, which means our ego identities, which are provisional. Ultimately, spiritual experience and religious experience are the same thing. They have three components. Number one, what we call transcendence. In Sanskrit, it's called turiya, going beyond the sensory experience that gives us the experience of perceptual reality. Turiya means going beyond the senses. In yoga, chit vritti nirod. So when all the vrittis, which are fluctuations of consciousness, die down, there is a domain of awareness which is beyond space and time. So that's called in English transcendence, in Sanskrit turiya. The second component of the religious experience or the spiritual experience, same thing, is what we call the emergence of Platonic values: truth, goodness, beauty, harmony, love, compassion, joy, equanimity. And the third component is the loss of the fear of death, because the transcendent self is not in space-time. So this is the experience universally, whether it's Muhammad or Rumi or Hafiz or you might say, the great rishis of India, Mirabai, Atmanand Krishna Menon, Krishna Murthy. You talk about Ramana Maharishi, Vivekanand, Ramakrishna. This is what they were talking about. Now, if somebody gives you this insight, and you say, they're pointing to the moon, you should be looking at the moon instead of worshipping the finger. So religious ideology is not the same thing as religious experience. In fact, there's no system of thought. Religion, system of thought; science, system of thought; theology, system of thought; philosophy, system of thought. No system of thought can give you access to truth. You have to transcend thought, because thought is what separates us.
So how do you transcend thought?
You transcend thought in that second verse of the first chapter of Patanjali, Chit Vritti Nirod. You silence the mind. As Rumi said, God's language is silence, everything else is poor translation. So you have to silence the mind. And for that, we have so many techniques. There are meditations, there are mantra practices, there is something called vagal stimulation, but the 8 limbs of yoga, the yamas, the niyamas, yoga asana, because yoga asana cultivates awareness in the body, pranayam, which is using the breath to influence your autonomic nervous system, pratyahara, which is withdrawal of the senses, and actually a new understanding in science, something they call interoception. Perception is looking at the outside world. Interoception is knowing what's happening in your body. There are yogic techniques to do that are mentioned very briefly as aphorisms in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, but when you actually practice them, you realize that these yogis were on to something very profound, controlling the autonomic nervous system and eavesdropping literally on the cosmic consciousness. So beyond Turiya Tata, beyond that Bhagavad Chetna, beyond that Brahmi Chetna, these are all encapsulated in the 8 limbs of yoga, including Dharana, Dhyan, Samadhi.
And that's what your next book is all about.
My next
Living in the Light, Yoga for Self-Realization, which you co-authored with Sarah Platfinger. I want to ask you, yoga, its association with India and the way in the recent times, Prime Minister Modi's worked towards taking yoga to the global forum and even getting the United Nations to dedicate a day to yoga. Do you, as a doctor, do you really believe spiritualism and yoga have a deep connection? And can that really be alternate medicine?
Yoga is not a system of thought. It's an experience for transcendence. It's an experience for higher consciousness. It's an experience for insight, intuition, creativity, archetypal consciousness, transcendence. So yoga, now we know very clearly through scientific studies, changes gene expression, so all the genes that are responsible for self-regulation, healing, homeostasis, decreased inflammation, longevity, all of them are activated. All the genes that are responsible for disease, like Alzheimer's, many types of cancer, autoimmune illness, inflammation, metabolic disorder, type 2 diabetes, all those genes get deactivated or decrease their activity. The level of the enzyme telomerase goes up significantly when you combine yoga with pranayama and meditation, and that enzyme controls how long we live. These are published studies. We have published them in scientific journals like Nature, and other people have replicated them. We have collaborated with Harvard and UCSF, with Nobel laureates. So nobody questions that yoga is a form of very profound healing. There are only 5% of diseases that are fully determined by gene mutations. These are called fully penetrant genetic mutations that will guarantee disease. So if you've heard, Angelina Jolie had the BRCA gene that predicted breast cancer, so she had to have preventive mastectomy, which was the right thing. Even for that, by the way, in the next few years, less than 5 years, we'll have something called gene editing. You'll be able to cut and paste genes the same way that you cut and paste your email. But that will affect only 8 or less than 5%. 95% of disease is determined by your quality of sleep, stress management, yoga and mind-body coordination, emotions, biological rhythms, and what we call self-realization. There's another big mistake. People think self-realization is self-improvement. It has nothing to do with self-improvement. It has nothing to do with motivation. So, you know, I'm frequently called a motivational speaker or somebody who's trying to help people with their lives. No. Self-realization is exactly what it says, to realize who you are, beyond body, mind, and ego identity.
That's a deep thought. That's a deep thought, and at that level, how many of us connect with ourselves, I don't really know, in this fast-paced life that we lead.
Navika, one more thing. Yoga, the word means union. Yuj, yuj. Union with what? Union with the self. Self is not your ego identity. Self is what in our tradition we call Atman, which is Brahman. So the self of the universe is the self of the universe is also the self of the individual. And that is the goal of yoga, to find out who you are, realize who you are, not self-improvement, not improve your blood pressure. It does that too. Okay.
Okay, but that's the side
that's a byproduct.
Byproduct. Dr. Chopra, I want to ask you, you've also been advising a few celebrities like Oprah Winfrey, Madonna. What advice would you give them, people like them? Does success not solve most problems, or does it create more problems? Or what kind of advice do you give such celebs?
Well, celebrities are actually some of the most insecure people in the world. And that is a good thing, because their insecurity drives their success. So the only advice I give them is embrace the wisdom of insecurity, because the biggest cause of insecurity is the search for security. So once you embrace insecurity, that unleashes your creativity.
Okay, and insecurity today exists in all walks of lives, whether you are a celebrity or not, because after COVID, there is insecurity of whether you have a job to go back to. There is insecurity on how your children will do. If you're a young adult, you're talking about what kind of jobs you'll get, what is the line of living that you're going to use. So there are insecurities possibly in everybody's life, celeb or not. So how should people deal with these insecurities?
Understand that what we call the known or the predictable or security is not the human condition. And it's a wonderful thing, because without that, there would be no creativity. Creativity only comes when you embrace insecurity, unpredictability. Otherwise, you're a biological robot. Predictable, you're at the mercy of every stranger on the street. You give somebody a compliment, they're happy. You say something nasty, they're offended for the rest of their lives. This is being a bundle of conditioned reflexes and nerves constantly being triggered by people and circumstance into very predictable outcomes. And the Vedanta and yoga call this the state of ignorance. The state of enlightenment is actually to know that all that we call security is the prison of the past. It doesn't exist. From this moment to the future, everything is unpredictable, and if you embrace that, you're all set. Now, during the pandemic, by the way, we were doing studies, our foundation, who's getting sick, who's dying. Older people had risk factors, inflammation, but they also had depression. Younger people who were dying or getting sick had what are called cytokine or inflammatory storms in their body as a result of stress. And we found that vagal stimulation, which is the opposite of the stress response, which actually is activated through yoga and chanting and humming and yogasana and pranayama, it activates a different part of our body called the vagal system or the parasympathetic nervous system. It mitigated these risk factors. So actually all those people who were not getting sick had the ability to counteract vagal stimulation. But then there were a lot of people who found opportunities. We have Zoom, we had new vaccines, we have mRNA, we have now the possibility of vaccines for cancer because of the pandemic, vaccines for other chronic illnesses. We learned about climate change. And, as soon as we were confined to our cages, nature was celebrating. You could see the Himalayas from 200 miles away. People were breathing for the first time in Bangalore. The fish were returning to the dead lakes of Venice. So we ought to learn something. First of all, this pandemic is nothing extraordinary. When I spoke to my father, he would talk about the Holocaust and the Second World War. My grandfather of the Great Depression and the First World War. My great-great-father of the Indian Civil War and the mutiny, as the British called it. There has never been a generation where there hasn't been a global crisis of significant magnitude or a financial crisis of of significant magnitude, or a worldwide pandemic from plague onwards of significant magnitude. We think we are unique, we are not. So, but it is time to learn something. We have technologies now, we have AI, we have so much technology to learn what is happening that we can actually prevent these things in the future. So war is the crisis, terrorism is the crisis, ethnocentrism is the crisis, religious conflict is the crisis, eco-destruction is the crisis, climate change is the crisis, extinction of species is the crisis, and COVID is part of that overall situation created by the human ego mind. That is the crisis.
So in today's world, there is a lot of strife. There is a war that has been going on for many, many months now. The world seems to be divided, into different regions, different poles, with conflicting requirements of each country. Do you see this strife really coming down? Is there a learning from COVID and the pandemic? Or actually, have we become even more self-centered after the pandemic?
It's both. In every crisis, there's certain people, demographic, who ask themselves, what have we learned and how can we evolve to the next stage? But in the same time, in every crisis, there's an entrenchment of traditional, old, divisive values. So we are living in a world today where emotionally and spiritually we have literally medieval minds, but we have modern capacities like nuclear weapons, cyber warfare, cyber hacking, on and on. I mentioned all these. So we are at a crossroads. Which way do we go? Not to, blow my own horn or importance, I have offered to world leaders solutions to everything from climate change to the global health crisis, how we can create a critical mass of consciousness in the world for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. I will be speaking to the United Nations about this, and I will, at the end of the year, CNN will carry a two-part series for an idea for a global movement that goes beyond national boundaries, where we have what we call emergence, where we have shared vision, where we complement each other's strengths, maximum diversity, and the best use of imagination to create a more peaceful, just, sustainable, and healthier world. Right now, the worst use of imagination is all this mechanized ways of killing each other, drones, this, that, the other. I have visited centers where there are drone operators sitting in some remote part in, say, Arizona, pressing buttons on computers, people dying in Afghanistan at a wedding, and then these guys go and smoke a cigarette and take a break, coffee break, and come and kill a few more people. And then they go home and play with their children and sleep at night. I do not understand how we can have a conscience where people are murdered in the name of religion, where people are murdered in the name of ideology or politics, or ultimately it's a racket to make money. I mean, who's making money right now? Arms dealers and brokers for weapons, and the big special interest groups in the world that sell everything that is destructive. So we need a global shift in consciousness, and ultimately it has to come to a global consciousness, because right now everybody has access to everything. I want any kind of information, I can go on Google, so everybody has access. We recently, during the pandemic, launched AI, artificial intelligence, emotional chat bot to prevent suicide. We found that young people were more comfortable talking to a machine than to a human being. this is the world we live in, because the machine wouldn't judge them. The machine would have an intimate relationship with them. We've now have 6,000 suicide preventions, 20 million people in conversation with the AI. We created a crypto to pay for it, so people wouldn't have to pay for it. So this is the future. We can create a global movement called emergence, as I said, where people decide what they want, what their values are. You ask anyone, if 5 years we continue with conflict, what is going to happen to our children, education, and the future economically? But if we resolve these conflicts, whether it's in Ukraine or Russia or Palestine or Israel or anywhere, India, Pakistan, conflict all over the world right now, ideological, and some of the more fundamental tendencies are coming out, right-wing, all over the world, globally, out of fear. But if we can actually say that there's a creative way to solve these problems, we should be creating a global movement. That's what I'm proposing to the UN. That's what I've proposed to the Vatican. And that's what I'm going to announce on CNN. And I'm telling you now.
But do you think vested groups will allow a resolution of all this? Because there's fundamentalism everywhere.
I don't think current leadership is sympathetic to this idea globally. But the people are. And ultimately, it's the people and their consciousness that elects people. So would anyone not want peace? Why is peace and prosperity linked together? You have to ask these questions. Can we reverse climate change? Can we solve conflict, religious or ideological? Can we collectively use our imagination to create instead of to destroy? The worst use of imagination is destruction and stress. The best use of imagination is creativity.
Dr. Chopra, fundamentalism has been on the rise. I mean, look at a football match. Morocco loses and there's violence. Talk about any religion. There were Hindus who were attacked in Leicester. There has been a rise in fundamentalism even back home. There is a debate on what's Hinduism and what's Hindutva. How do you think this fundamentalism is affecting world peace and the thought process of the generations that are watching all this and are at an impressionable stage?
So we spoke earlier where you actually reminded me that Hinduism is an English word and Hindutva is actually the accurate description.
One would just translate.
Is the accurate description. So I don't see any difference between the two other than interpretation. But once again, look at Hinduism itself is a culture. It's a way of life. It is actually the ultimate way, in a way, to transcend ideology. When we speak of religion and religious ideology or philosophy or theology, as I mentioned before, they are systems of thought. But actually, if you go to the great teachings of the great luminaries, the rishis of the Upanishads, or other luminaries in modern times, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Krishnamurti, Atmanand Krishna Menon, Nisargadatta Maharaj, these are fairly recent contemporaries who took us beyond systems of thought into the experience of who we are, into self-knowing. And today, the major discussion in science, if you go and type out the following question, what are the 125 open questions in science? Open questions. The number one open question in science is, what is the universe made of? And the number two open question in science is what's the biological basis of consciousness? Now, the reason we can't answer these questions, in my opinion, is that they're wrong questions. The universe is not made of anything. The universe is made of nothing, actually, because 97% of the universe is unobservable and will never be observed because it is not made of atomic matter. But it's dark energy, dark matter, which is not atomic. You and I are made of atoms. So we can interact with light. If something doesn't emit light or refract light, we don't know what it is. And it's not only unknown, it's unknowable. 3% of the universe is atomic, out of which 99.999% is invisible interstellar dust. So the visible universe, which is 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, uncountable trillions of planets, according to current astrobiology, 60 billion habitable planets probably in the Milky Way galaxy. Just in the Milky Way galaxy, and there are 2 trillion galaxies. So habitable planets, the way they identify them, or think they identify them, through these new telescopes, is they look for an atmosphere, a biosphere, which they call the Goldilocks zone. So if a planet is too close to its sun, too hot, no life as we know it. Planet too far away, no life as we know it, too cold. But within this range, life as we know it, not only likely, or probable, but almost certain. With that calculation, 60 billion habitable planets in the Milky Way galaxy. Multiply that with 2 trillion galaxies, our planet is not even a speck of dust in the junkyard of infinity which we have created. So if you take all the beaches of the world, you take 1 grain of sand, that's planet Earth. On that planet, we have all these issues that we are engaging with and fighting about, and they're just ideas. So if you transcend those ideas, you will find that there's a universal truth. Whatever you call it, Brahman, Allah, Ein Sof, God, the mystery,
Vishnu, Brahma,
those are symbolic representations of ultimate reality.
I really don't know how to respond to this. वो कहा जाता है much ado about nothing.
Much ado about nothing. बिल्कुल. इतनी लड़ाई किस लिए? आइडिया मेरा आपसे डिफरेंट है. एक्सपीरियंस सेम है, इंटरप्रिटेशन डिफरेंट. उस पे झगड़ा करो, kill each other, murder each other, even get medals. Wear a uniform and you now justify murder with medals. This is the human insanity. If we don't think it's insane, then we are part of the insanity. To be well adjusted to an insane world is not a statement of sanity.
But that's the world we live in. So,
well, then what
universal truth कैसे ढूंढा जाए? Where is the universal truth, and what is this reality that we are in search of?
So these days, because of the emergence of virtual reality, immersive experiences, augmented reality, metaverse, we can actually create a 3D experience of the world in virtual reality, create our own avatar and insert it there, not realizing that this, what we live in, is also a virtual reality. What we are experiencing right now, this theater of space-time and causality, you, me, this studio, New Delhi, India, the world, that's part of the virtual reality too. It's a digital printout, 3D, moving printout in a cosmic consciousness or non-local domain, whatever you want to call it again. The ultimate reality cannot be perceived. The ultimate reality cannot be conceptualized. The ultimate reality cannot be imagined. It's irreducible. It's fundamental. It's without cause. It is beyond space-time. It is spaceless, timeless, infinite, and formless. When Tagore said, in this playhouse of infinite forms, I caught sight of the formless, and so my life was blessed. If you can get in touch with that part of you, which has no form, then it can morph into any form. And that is what ultimate reality is. Nothing perceptual. Even the Vedanta, Adi Shankara, if you can see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, conceptualize it, imagine it, think about it, it's not real. What is real is the source of those concepts, which is fundamental consciousness itself. Consciousness is not a property of the brain. In fact, the brain is also an experience in consciousness. Right now, you're looking at me, right? All that's going to your eyes is colorless photons. All that's going to your brain is an electrical current. All that's happening in your brain is chemistry. But you're experiencing this with colors, shapes, sounds, textures. How is it happening? That is the ultimate mystery that cannot be solved through science or philosophy or religion. You have to actually have the experience of yoga in its true sense. Yog Chit Vritti Nirodh. That is what joy is.
But Dr. Chopra, while I understand this spirituality or search for that formless identity that is the ultimate, how does that one do that in a working life? Because ultimately जो भी फॉर्म है, जो भी ये 3D एक्सपीरियंस है, इसमें जहाँ ब्रेन चलती है वहाँ एक पेट भी है. So you're hungry, you have needs, you have to work, and your career keeps you.
ये सब पूछते हैं, ये सवाल सब पूछते हैं. पर अगर if joy is not your experience of existence, then you have wasted your life. It doesn't matter what. You may have become a multi-billionaire, you have the best health in the world, you're going to grow old, you're going to have infirmity, you're going to die. At the end of that, do you want to say, I never experienced joy, which was the fundamental state of being? So if you make that a principle, that joy is the only measure of success, आनंदा जिसे कहते हैं, joy, आनंदा शक्ति, उसकी शक्ति जब तक नहीं है, वो तूर्या की शक्ति है, तूर्य तत्ता की शक्ति है, भगवान चेतना की शक्ति है, ब्रह्मी चेतना की शक्ति है, इच्छा की शक्ति है, क्रिया की शक्ति है. वो शक्ति अगर हमारे में नहीं है, तो ये जो इल्यूजन है जिसको हम कहते हैं माया और for a perceptual activity in consciousness. So the practical aspect of all this is we can upgrade our health, our well-being, our longevity, our personal interactions, our social interactions, our environment, and in fact create that critical mass for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier world. That's, call me crazy, but there are a lot of people who actually feel that this is the future, otherwise we are sleepwalking to extinction.
पर ये माया जाल से निकलना कैसे?
माया जाल से निकल नहीं सकते, पर माया जाल में हर एक जाल में holes होते हैं. Jump through the hole. you have to
find. Everybody has to find their own hole.
Every jal has a little hole. You jump through it, and then you can still participate. Why do you go to movies now? Because you like to be entertained, right? Some people like horror movies. They like tragedies. They like fear. So it's all good. Whatever it is, that's the way it is. But we can belong to a motley group of sages, scientists, philosophers, and maybe even psychotics who can envision a better world.
I want to ask you another, impact of the pandemic has been mental health of people, and even in India, the issue is all about suicide levels going up. The NCRB data, National Crime Research Bureau data, shows a 7% increase in suicide rates.
So I would ask everyone who's listening to us or watching us to go to this website, www.neveralone.love. Again, www.neveralone.love. We have our AI, machine and deep learning system there, which has now prevented, as I said, 6,000 suicides, having 20 million conversations. I just went to the UAE. I spoke to the Minister of AI in Dubai, and they want to adopt this in Arabic. I would love if we did it in Hindi as well. But even those who are watching right now, they can interact with our suicide prevention program by going to www.neveralone.love. It's non-profit.
But is it about stress?
Oh,
Is
absolutely. It's about loneliness and stress. People are more connected, but more lonely. So they're connected at one level, but they're more lonely. And as I said, they have confused themselves with their image. So everybody's looking for how many likes, how many dislikes. And, you know, the internet can be very vicious in attacking people. There is cyberbullying, there is stress.
Social media?
Social media. But social media can be used for good as well.
No, but I'm one of those who only gets abused.
That's right, because as long as you're a public figure, you have to recognize that it comes with criticism, and if you respond to it, then you'll be offended for the rest of your life. The best way to deal with your critics is to ignore them. They can't stand it. Don't respond. But destruction is the perfect recipe for extinction. The last extinction was 65 million years ago, when a meteorite fell on this earth, and it was the equivalent of an atomic bomb. It wiped out dinosaurs in a few days. If that hadn't happened, you and I wouldn't be here. We emerged because of the extinction of that species. If this species goes extinct, something better will emerge, and maybe nature will decide that the human experiment was very interesting, but it didn't work. It's now up to us to make it work.
Otherwise, we run the risk of becoming extinct.
Absolutely.
And
the next extinction will be because of humans.
Are we talking? Are you also somebody who can look into the future because you connect with the formless? How soon is that going to happen? Can we relax while?
For climate change, we have maybe 50 years, 60 years to handle climate change. Otherwise, it's almost too late already. You know, now the G20 is happening in India, and I've seen some signs, and they quote the Sanskrit, the Vedanta, they say, Vasudev Kutumbakam. And I was thinking, what a great slogan for India, Vasudev Kutumbakam, the world is my family. And instead, India is the only country in the world that has never attempted to colonize the world through militarism. Never. You know, one or two occasions where we rescued, maybe, you know, in Pondicherry, it was our territory, Bangladesh, we rescued them. But India has never colonized militarily. India is colonizing the world today through technology, through its fashion, through its music, through its entertainment, through its food, through its spirituality. So Vasudev Kutumbakam G20 should be India becoming a global influencer for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. This is India's responsibility because India has the knowledge. India has the wisdom. India has the luminaries, and India has the technology. India has the education. India is a global international influencer. If we just take care of one thing in our country, which is poverty, which is still there, despite the amazing progress of the middle class, of the rich, the infrastructures that are coming. If India, we could tackle its poverty, and we have the wherewithal and the creativity to do that, this is a global leader in the world. It has to be, because the rest are interested in power mongering, influence peddling, cronyism, corruption, bureaucracy. And I say that with total honesty, living in the United States, I've never seen more ideological conflict and more polarization in the US. Some people even predict a civil war in today's age. So, you know, that's a very sad situation, and a total lack of imagination and creativity.
But our own, politics back home says we are on the cusp of civil war, because that's the language.
That's why we
the
need to
opposition.
embrace authentically our own knowledge. The knowledge that India is giving to the world has to be embraced by us first. And that is the most profound knowledge. Vasudev Kutumbakam. We go beyond narrow boundaries. You know, look at Rabindranath Tagore's poetry and what he talks about. Let my nation awake to that realm of reality where it becomes an embodiment of beauty, intuition, nurturing, and tenderness, and creativity, and healing.
But we are fighting even about, the color saffron.
So let's stop it.
And
It
why?
comes, when your awareness is constricted and fearful, you fight about ideas and colors, and you fight about who's talking to whom about what. If you're expanded a little bit, then you don't fight about those things. You fight about maybe economic empowerment. But if you're expanded beyond that, you talk about great ideas that can bring creative solutions. And if you're visionary, then you don't talk about anything. You have a vision, you create the ideal team, you have maximum diversity, you leverage everybody's strengths, you dream, and then you actualize the dream.
Dr. Deepak Chopra, what are the other things? I mean, I also learned that you advise, or you're the scientific advisor amongst a few others who advise the Pope. So how does that work? You have an insight into all religions, and you pick the best from all, because हमें तो यही सिखाया गया है कि different religions are, the goal is the same. The paths may be a little different.
You know, the current Pope at the Vatican is a very amazing human being. He's actually quite liberal. He's scientifically very interested in cosmology and consciousness. The Vatican has some of the best scientists, astronomers, and biologists who are priests, but who are very highly qualified scientists. But like every other place in the Vatican, there is politics, there is schism, there are ideological conflicts that the Pope has to handle. He has to be very careful because he has to take care of his so-called constituency. It's actually, Vatican is a country recognized by the UN. So there's politics there also. There is nowhere I have been, religious institution, where there is not conflict, where there is not politics. But because this Pope is more sympathetic to resolution of ideological conflicts, he is very open to interfaith dialogue. And in fact, recently we participated in an interfaith dialogue between the Arab world and the Christian world. And we are proposing interfaith dialogues between the Jewish world and the Arab world, between the Muslim world and the Hindu world, there are crazy conflicts in the world that make no sense. I was in Ireland a few years ago, and we were lost. And my driver said, there was no GPS, he didn't have GPS, or it wasn't there. GPS is pretty recent. So I said, why don't you ask that person walking down the street? He says, I can't. I said, why can't you? He says, because he's Protestant. I said, how do you know he's Protestant? You haven't even talked to him. He says, I can tell by the way he walks and the way he looks, his gestures. So this kind of schism between two religious denominations in a land that considers itself Christian, they've had conflict around this, bombing, war, killings. Why? Because I'm Protestant, you're Christian. If that is not insane, what is insanity? But, interfaith dialogue right now, looking at the commonalities of the spiritual experience, could indeed be a very useful thing to do if you want peace and prosperity.
Yes, utopia is also
But
a state of mind, something to desire for, will it actually happen?
But Navika, right now, it's the most dystopian atmosphere ever. So between utopia and this extreme dystopian world we live in, there is a middle path.
Absolutely. No debate on that. Dr. Chopra, you also mentioned that you're starting a new thing where you're going to be speaking to people of all countries from Times Squares. What is that new initiative?
Times Square has come up with a new initiative. It's called TSX. TSX stands for Times Square Experiences. And it's basically entertainment, like what used to be MTV globally, going from Times Square 24 hours on all the billboards. But if you have a phone, a smartphone, you can actually listen through the app. So this will be global programming every day. I have been given a half an hour slot daily to speak through the world and give some guidance on health, longevity, and the evolution of consciousness. So I'm looking forward to this.
And when does this begin?
It starts in a couple of months, globally. You'll be able to pick it up here, anywhere.
So, Dr. Chopra, how do you see yourself? A global citizen, an Indian?
I don't see myself as a global citizen. I see myself as a citizen of the universe. Global is too small.
That's profound.
Aham Brahmasmi. It's not original. It's Aham Brahmasmi. You are the universe. Without you and your consciousness, there's no experience of what we call reality.
Well, in the quest of that experience of reality where we connect with ourselves and become one with the universe, which is formless, says Dr. Deepak Chopra. Well, that quest is something that we all need to focus on, because our one priority right now as citizens of this universe should be the end of strife and actually the joy of living, if it can really be brought back into our lives, instead of the ego, ye mera, ye tumhara nahi, ye hamara. If all of that can be resolved, well, let's hope to do so. Let's walk the path. Thank you very much, Dr. Deepak Chopra, for joining me here on Frankly Speaking. Every once in a while, it's great to have this completely calming impact in the middle of that political din and the run around that our jobs
Thank you for allowing me to be frank on Frankly Speaking. Formless and form go together. Without the formless, there's no form. Just like on and off go together. There's no on without the off.
Amazing, simply put, and philosophy of life in just those few words. Thank you very much, Dr. Deepak Chopra, and thank you, viewers, for joining me on this very special episode of Frankly Speaking.